Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I will tell you about an HOA that says I can't swim in my swimming pond. My grandfather proudly told my sisters and me that he and his friends had dug our own swimming pond when he came home with calloused hands and a huge smile. According to him, it was meant to nurture family memories for generations. This happened year after year. It became the center of our family gatherings. My sisters and I spent hot summer days swimming, skipping rocks, and holding epic, sometimes makeshift, diving competitions. The fact that my grandfather sweated, laughed, and persevered to make the pond ours was everything to me as a child. He believed an old-fashioned swimming pond was more than just a cooling-off spot. He thought it fed the soul. In place of pristine tile and sharp edges, the pond had gentle slopes and reeds around the edge. Fish sometimes swam deeper, where we rarely went. Dragonflies hovered like tiny, iridescent helicopters, and frogs leapt from nearby lily pads. Small turtles sunning on rocks were fun to spot. My grandfather wanted my sisters and me to connect with nature like you can't in a pool. He sat me on his knee when I was 6 or 7 and said, "One day, you'll own this entire property, and this pond is going to remind you how important it is to stand up for what's yours." I had no idea how prophetic those words were. I never questioned whether we were allowed to swim in our pond as kids. We owned the property and pond. What else was there to discuss? I maintained that indifference into adulthood. My sisters visited every summer with their children, who loved the pond after moving away for new jobs. I always declined family suggestions to install a modern pool. It seemed disrespectful to my grandfather, who had worked hard to build our idyllic home. I had the perfect swimming spot outside my back door, so there was no need for a pool. However, my surroundings changed over time. Many neighboring properties were sold and subdivided. A development appeared overnight after new roads were built. In some areas, farmland and open land are replaced by new neighborhoods with neat yards and flashy 2-story homes. It didn't bother me at first. Progress is progress, and new neighbors could mean new friends. It also created new homeowner associations to regulate lawn height and mailbox design. This is how I learned about the Creekwood Council, a HOA that claimed authority over dozens of properties near me. They left thick envelopes with rules, claiming they supervised land within a certain perimeter. I initially dismissed it. I didn't need a homeowner association because my property was carved out decades before these developments. I didn't use their water or utilities. My property taxes went to a different office. No HOA was mentioned in my deed. I ignored the letters and politely declined any offers, but the messages kept coming. Tabitha, a strange woman, would visit every couple of weeks with a pastel-colored pamphlet listing all the rules she thought I had to follow. It had the usual restrictions of many associations: no fences above a certain height, no large dog breeds without approval, strict landscaping rules, etc. Tabitha initially appeared polite but firm. She politely explained that HOA membership increased property values, neighborly cooperation, and community voice. I always said, "I'm good, thanks," or "I'm not under your HOA," and she left without a fuss. However, each visit became more confrontational, as if my land being outside her control was a personal affront. She saw me in my backyard, swim trunks on, by the pond, ready to cannonball. She ran over, ignoring my privacy requests. She told me well-mannered people have real pools if they want to swim, with her fists on her hips. I was surprised, but I assumed she disapproved. Next time, she brought Donnie. An official-looking logo was embroidered on his stiff polo shirt. Tabitha said he was on the HOA Compliance Committee. They delivered a formal notice. Creekwood Council regulations require recreational water to meet the same standards as a swimming pool. You violated the following rules. She handed me a paper with water treatment and signage requirements. They even required a licensed lifeguard presence if the depth exceeded 5 feet. Paying someone to watch me swim alone in my pond made me laugh. Donnie looked mortified I didn't take him seriously. Remembering my grandfather's rule to never let hotheads control a conversation, I kept calm. I politely asked Tabitha and Donnie to leave. Again, I told them my land was private and not HOA governed. They ignored me, citing some obscure language about annexation. I hired an attorney that day. The local lawyer I found had experience with overreaching HOAs. She was kind and knowledgeable, and after reviewing my property documents, she was sure there was no legal obligation to follow Creekwood Council rules. She wrote a letter stating so. I sent copies to Tabitha and Donnie, hoping that would finish it. It was not, unfortunately. A few weeks passed without incident. One hot afternoon, I took a float and a paperback book to the pond. Tabitha and Donnie returned as I settled in. 3 people arrived, including a tall woman with sunglasses on her head. I nearly laughed at her grandiose title, Marcella, Vice Chair of External Relations. Marcella told me that HOA rules prohibited wild swimming in the area, especially if the pond was not approved for recreational use by a committee. This speech went on about water quality checks, liability insurance, and pool deck color standards. I wanted to interrupt her to say, "This isn't a deck." I kept quiet because I knew interrupting would lengthen the lecture. After her monologue, I showed her my attorney's letter, which clearly stated that the HOA had no authority over my property. Marcella's face hardened. She said I was being uncooperative, that the association had resources to ensure safety standards, and that it was in my best interest to comply. I told her this conversation was over as calmly as possible. They were dumbfounded as I turned away and stepped into the pond. Tabitha's face was priceless, like someone had told her the sky was green. For once, she was silent. Donnie seemed determined to record the entire thing on his phone for evidence. They left soon after, shouting that I'd regret my actions. That might seem like the drama's peak, but it was just the beginning. The association began sending me more threatening letters in my mailbox. They demanded past due compliance fees and threatened to lien my property if I didn't pay. This was unenforceable, but it was a fear tactic. After asking my lawyer, she advised me to document everything. "They can't do anything except harass you," she said. I scanned and saved each letter, then filed the hard copies. We wrote several responses stating that you have no jurisdiction. It appeared the HOA might tire of this back and forth. However, the situation quickly became absurd. I was floating in the pond on a sunny afternoon when a shrill voice screeched across the water, "Get out of the water now!" I opened my eyes to see Tabitha on the bank with her phone. Her companions were 2 men with HOA security shirts. If not funny, it could have been intimidating. They said I was trespassing in a restricted waterway, so my pond was restricted, apparently. Shaking my head, I told them to leave. Tabitha shouted, "I'm calling the police!" I didn't reply. I closed my eyes again, refusing to let her see me upset. I kept my cool despite my heart palpitations. Flashing red and blue lights appeared 15 minutes later. Walked to the bank to greet the responding officers. Tabitha immediately began ranting about how I had broken HOA rules and ignored multiple orders. She said she told me 10 times to stop swimming in that makeshift pond. Her tone was absurdly condescending. One officer, a middle-aged man who looked like he'd been around the block many times, calmly asked, "Sir, can you clarify the situation?" I explained that this is my private property. My family built the pond decades ago, and the HOA has no legal authority here. I even showed the old fence line, the date-stamped deed, and my attorney's letter, which I kept in a waterproof sleeve due to the repeated incidents. Tabitha looked triumphant for a moment, probably thinking she'd accomplished something big by calling the police. "Ma'am, do you have any documentation that proves you have authority over this property?" She babbled about their bylaws, and the officer patiently explained that she could not enforce anything on my land without a recorded easement, covenant, or deed restriction. As I stood in my wet trunks, he apologized for the inconvenience. He said, "This is a civil matter, and if you're not part of their association, you're not subject to their rules." Tabitha turned red, but she tried one more time. "So, you're not going to do anything about his illegal swimming?" The officer smiled and said, "Ma'am, that's not a criminal matter." I was relieved. What he said next was gold. "If you keep trespassing on his property to harass him, that could become a crime." His partner nodded. Tabitha shouted something inaudible and left. The HOA security guys followed her reluctantly, looking quite embarrassed. The officer nodded and said good day. I thought that would be the final blow, that the HOA would concede defeat. I was wrong. They decided to keep ruining my life. They intensified their tactics in subsequent weeks. The old fence that marked my property boundary had bright orange stickers on its posts, claiming it was not up to code. They left official-looking documents pinned to my front door while I was grocery shopping. One time, a HOA member came onto my property and hammered a wooden stake with the words "Private Pool Standards Enforcement under investigation." I was furious. This was obvious trespassing. I consulted with my lawyer again, who wrote a harsh cease and desist letter warning them of the legal consequences for violating my property rights. I installed motion-activated cameras around the pond perimeter because things got tense. The recording showed that HOA badge holders were walking around the property with clipboards and taking photos while I was away. This went beyond annoying. It violated my privacy and security. I was entitled to defend my land. I considered filing trespassing charges, but my lawyer advised waiting to see if they kept trying. I was also talking to my sisters, who were furious that the HOA was tarnishing our grandfather's legacy. They offered to stay with me to deter trespassers by being on the property more. That decision brought my two sisters and one of their teenage sons together one evening. We discussed a solution in the living room. The nephew, bright-eyed and full of teenage vigor, offered to camp near the pond with a camera. He was joking, but we thought about it. We thought our cameras would be enough evidence if the HOA did something bolder. We then did what families do best: lighten the mood. The purple and pink sky illuminated our dusk swim in the pond. A strange mix of tension and familial warmth permeated the air. I remember being proud and angry. HOA or not, I wouldn't let anyone take this. My sisters wanted to walk the perimeter the next morning to check for new trespassing. Footprints in the damp soil a few feet from the water made our blood boil. A small gravel mound was nearby. It looked like someone was there late at night or early in the morning. After reviewing the footage, we saw a hooded figure near the pond at 2 a.m. fiddling with something at the edge. It was hard to tell the face, but the stance and silhouette suggested Donnie. It was hard to describe my rage. More than just HOA notices, this was an invasion of privacy and possibly a property sabotage attempt. My lawyer was shocked when I showed him the footage. She suggested calling the police for trespassing. However, the HOA moved again before I could. Marcella, remember the vice chair of external relations? She and her friend Celine arrived at my door. They matched in navy blue HOA crest polo shirts. I opened the door to dismiss them, but Marcella spoke first in a chillingly cheerful voice. "We're here to discuss a compromise," she said. My sisters and I looked at each other, unsure of their strategy. Marcella said she convinced the board to give me a grace period to fix the pond. She suggested installing a filtration system, deck, fence with a self-closing gate, and paying monthly HOA dues plus a penalty for non-compliance. She had a binder full of photos of how locals had transformed natural ponds into swimming pools. This would destroy the pond's natural integrity and cost a fortune. Her face fell when I calmly repeated that I wasn't under her HOA or their compromise. Cold anger replaced the fake friendliness. "I see," she said. "You'll make us do this the hard way." I felt my heart racing. It was amazing how quickly their civility vanished. They left, promising to contact us soon. After the door closed, I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I holding. My sisters were furious and shaken. After all, they were trespassing, showing up unannounced and making veiled threats in addition to sending letters. My nephew overheard part of the conversation and was furious. "This is insane," he repeated. "Your property." I decided to report it to the police. Enough was enough. The next morning, I collected the videos, threatening letters, and footprint images. My lawyer helped me write a statement. Walking into the local police station, we knew this had to be documented. Our officer took our report professionally and seemed concerned. He said he'd tell the detective division if anything else was needed. Naturally, the big question was, who was coming onto my land at night? Although the silhouette resembled Donnie, we couldn't identify the HOA board member. Still, it was recorded. If they tried anything else, the police had a base. Days passed. My sisters returned home, but they left their cameras to help me watch. A late afternoon commotion caught my attention near my driveway entrance. A sleek black SUV arrived. I saw Tabitha and a stranger exiting the car through the window. His sharp suit made me suspect he was HOA legal counsel. Since I didn't want them near my house, we met outside. The suited man introduced himself as an attorney representing Creekwood Council. He handed me a thick envelope before I could speak. I received a cease and desist letter from them demanding I stop swimming in the pond. They called it a nuisance and dangerous to local wildlife. I might have laughed if I wasn't so mad. My family's pond, home to frogs, turtles, birds, and who knows what else, was now dangerous to wildlife. The nerve of calling it a nuisance, as if I was polluting the neighborhood. I calmly told them I had a lawyer who would gladly respond to this nonsense. The suit-wearing man smiled. "We'll see," and left. Tabitha whispered, "We keep records of everything." I told them to leave. My lawyer was calmly exasperated by their letter. She noted that they were going to great lengths, likely because they feared that if I proved they had no authority, Other homeowners in their domain would question the HOA's power. I hadn't considered that angle. They may have doubled down to prevent word that someone had resisted the HOA's demands. It occurred to me that if I publicly announced that I had defeated them, they might lose their desire to control. The new neighbor next door came over to chat as if reading my mind. I barely knew them. Call him Hector. He said the HOA had criticized his siding color, mailbox design, and even his wife's front yard flowers. He was done. He heard rumors about a big property owner fighting the association. When he recognized me, he asked for advice. I told him your options are limited if you're under their HOA contract, but he said the board was breaking its own rules and pushing him around without due process. We bonded over our dislike of overreaching boards. I told him about my trespassing and repeated attempts to force me to comply. Hector suspected the HOA was funding board members' personal projects with fines and penalties. He had heard Tabitha's backyard deck had been upgraded by the HOA's regular contractor. Another neighbor told him the HOA gave Donnie's cousin a big landscaping contract. They might be padding their pockets, Hector thought. This revelation was expected. As I learned more, their overreaching made sense. They were power-hungry and financially motivated to control everyone. Hector invited me to a barbecue in the new subdivision, which might frighten them. He said the HOA held an annual park party. The idea was to bring a dish, socialize, and celebrate the community spirit. He invited me to join him. Did I really want to enter the lion's den? However, Hector pointed out that this was a public event in a public park funded by HOA dues, so they couldn't ban me. Perhaps we could use it to clear the air with some neighbors. Inform them that the pond was mine and that the HOA was lying about controlling my land. I arrived at the park with Hector in his pickup truck on barbecue day. Tabitha was directing people to tables while Donnie watched the grill. Marcella spoke with a group of residents, smiling her usual forced smile. Tabitha's eyes widened when she saw me. She ran over to block me. "You aren't a member of this community," she whispered. I showed her a sign that read, "All neighborhood residents and their guests welcome." Hector waved and said I was his guest. She stood mouth agape and we moved deeper into the park before she could protest. I talked to people for an hour, many of whom were unaware of the HOA conflict. After learning the association was trying to control a property outside their boundaries, several neighbors supported it. A few older residents had heard about that old swimming pond but never visited because it was private. I asked for a hot dog, which a teenage volunteer gave me. Despite Donnie's death stares from behind the grill, I kept my cool to avoid a fight at their event. Marcella twice passed by, pressing her lips together to bite back comments. I caught a glimpse of their attorney in the suit, looking exasperated at my presence. I spoke to HOA leader Annie. She appeared more reasonable. She said the board had concerns about pond liability and safety. I stated that it was not their jurisdiction. She surprised me by saying, "You know, I always thought it was weird that they kept insisting you belong to the association." She apologized for the board's handling of her request for your documents. I thanked her for her honesty and told her the board could talk to my lawyer if they wanted to talk, but I was done being harassed. I was surprised how peacefully that evening ended. I felt lighter after the barbecue, but the fight continued. It turned out my presence there caused waves. I claimed the HOA had no authority over me, and word spread. In a small town, rumors spread quickly. Hector said the board members were furious at me for shaming them in front of other residents. I discovered they had called an emergency board meeting to discuss my supposed offenses. I was included in another group email despite never signing up. I politely but firmly reminded them that my lawyer said I wasn't in their HOA. Within days, the county clerk sent a letter. My attorney informed the local government, which responded. My property was not in the HOA's domain, according to the letter. I pinned it to my fridge like a proud parent displaying an A+ test. I then sent copies to Tabitha, Donnie, Marcella, and all board members with email addresses. I hoped this was the last piece. Silence ensued. No new suspicious footprints appeared by the pond, and threats and visits stopped. My sisters planned their next big family visit, relieved at the break. They wanted to pass on the pond swimming tradition to their children. It was perfect timing as the weather warmed. I hoped the ordeal was over. Just as I was about to relax, the biggest surprise hit. A pounding at my front door woke me up one Saturday morning. I put on a robe and ran downstairs, expecting an Amazon delivery or my sister. Instead, I saw two policemen through the peephole. Heart sank. What now? Opening the door, I tried to be calm. One officer said, "We got a report of an unauthorized structure being erected on your property. I was shocked when the caller said you were building a pool without a permit. I realized the HOA must have known I was building a pool. I explained everything again, showing the pond through the back window. It's not a new structure," I said. "It's older than me." The officers seemed embarrassed to bother me. To confirm, they politely requested entry into the backyard. I concurred. When they saw the pond, they knew it wasn't a new pool or modern construction. The pond was natural and decades old. The officers apologized and left, but I could tell they were upset about the false report. Knowingly lying to police is a serious crime. I considered pressing it. Maybe that would end these antics. My attorney and I discussed it. She suggested we file a complaint about the HOA's repeated misuse of emergency services, especially after they called 911 on me for swimming illegally. This time, I was determined to act. They would face consequences if they kept using the police for personal harassment. I filed the complaint with both police reports. I included the county clerk's letter and their pond arrival video. A few weeks later, a detective called to say they were looking into repeated harassment and possible misuse of public resources. His questions showed that the authorities were taking this more seriously. I was asked if Tabitha, Donnie, or Marcella had knowingly lied. I promised to try to find it. Hector and other frustrated residents testified that the board had been bragging about forcing me to toe the line. They showed meeting minutes where the board discussed creative ways to make me comply. Though never explicitly stated, the tone implied they would file false reports if necessary. This prompted police to question HOA leadership. Tabitha's station interview was rumored. Donnie also left the station with a thunderous face. No one was arrested, but the mood changed. They seemed to be losing their intimidation campaign. The outcome? Hector's insiders say Marcella and other board members resigned. Residents suspicious of contractor nepotism demanded a thorough financial review of the HOA's actions. The remaining board members unanimously removed Tabitha from her position. Donnie disappeared, but rumors said he was still partly involved in the HOA. The new leadership tried to calm the drama by announcing no further action on my pond. Finally, I could breathe easily. I won more than just swimming in my grandfather's pond without intrusion. I knew I had resisted bullies who tried everything to gain power. My sisters and I sat on the deck one late summer evening, our feet in the pond's cool water. We joked that our grandfather would have laughed at a HOA telling us where to swim. Now that I could, my nephew asked if I would install a modern pool. I said, "Why bother? I only need this pond." We laughed heartily. I felt content in that moment, surrounded by family and the setting sun. Justice won in this corner of the world. After a fight and a lot of nerves, the HOA's biggest mistake was calling the police too often. They thought they could scare me into compliance. They had no idea that my grandfather taught me resilience and the value of independence and our family legacy. They also underestimated good neighbors' willingness to help each other fight petty tyranny. Their 911 calls backfired, raising police suspicions and turning the tide against them. My family still dives into that pond every summer, a symbol of our strength and ownership. For now, the new HOA board has left me alone. They're too busy soothing residents who discovered the board's duplicity. Hector says the association bylaws are being rewritten to increase transparency and accountability. Sometimes neighbors stop by to admire the pond from afar. They often comment on how peaceful it is compared to the development's cookie-cutter pools. I've invited a few to splash around if they want. The pond is still a place for community building, on my terms, not a HOA's. My sisters are planning another big family reunion soon, and I'm planning a day of laughter, splashing, and possibly a frog-catching competition for the kids. Life has returned to satisfaction. Naturally, the cameras remain in case anyone gets ideas, but I haven't seen any unwanted guests lately. It appears I was heard. I won't be forced to give up my rights. That pond holds my grandfather's spirit, and each ripple reminds me to protect what's mine. Knowing we overcame all the trouble makes our peace sweeter. Although HOAs seem to reappear when least expected, I stand at the edge of the pond each morning with coffee and watch the sun dance on the surface. When I see a dragonfly glinting in the light, I think of my proud, stubborn grandfather who refused to be told what to do on his land. This may be a family trait. If someone tries to police my natural oasis, they should expect a fight. I have the proof, legal backing, and stubbornness to keep swimming in my home since childhood. No matter how many notices they put on my door or how many times they type my address into their phone, This is my property, and I will protect it. I can install a high-tech blue-tiled pool with a neat deck and matching loungers. But why? My simple pond has more character, heart, and history than any fancy new construction. The water may be murky and I may have to remove leaves, but that's part of the fun. I'd rather swim with turtles and fish than see chlorine blue walls. My nephew sometimes threatens to bring a huge inflatable unicorn float when he visits. Bring it on! The freedom to enjoy something without petty rules or overzealous committees is part of the fun. Looking back, I almost appreciate the chaos. It taught me that if you stick to the law, the truth will prevail. The HOA learned that mistreating the wrong property owner can backfire. I renewed my family's bond and heritage, strengthening our resolve to preserve that pond. Water symbolizes my grandfather's dreams, my childhood memories, and our enduring spirit. Friends, thank you. See you soon.